The morning room at Brackenstall Manor possessed that peculiar quality of damp gentility that characterizes the residences of the English gentry, a room where valuable furniture fought a losing battle against encroaching mildew, and where the wallpaper's pattern had faded to the color of old bruises. Coffee was served in a Sèvres pot of considerable age, attended by a woman whom Lord Peter deduced, within moments of her entering, to be the housekeeper. She had the bearing of someone who had been reorganizing the domestic universe for approximately 30 years and had consequently developed opinions about matters that ought to have remained beyond her purview. "Mrs. Chelton?" Lord Peter inquired pleasantly, noting the faint indentation upon her left ring finger that suggested a marriage concluded either by death or circumstance. "Yes, my lord," she replied, with the slight stiffness that indicated surprise at being addressed at all. "Mr. Ashford was taken ill at approximately 9 o'clock last evening. Very sudden it was. One moment he was reading his newspaper in the library, and the next, well." She paused, and Lord Peter detected in that pause a significant volume of unspoken observation. The doctor came within the hour. "Heart failure," he said, "though I've never known a man's heart to fail so very dramatically. Lord Peter sipped his coffee with the air of a man sampling a particularly interesting vintage. "An unusual descriptor for a medical event, Mrs. Chelton. Do clarify." She shifted her weight, and her eyes found the window. A habit of servants who have said more than they ought and are endeavoring to calculate the damage. "There was the matter of the smell, sir, the burning. Not the sort of smell one associates with, well, with passing away, naturally." Miss Ashford, who had been regarding her coffee cup with the intensity of a fortune-teller examining tea leaves, looked up sharply. "Mrs. Chelton, you never mentioned—" "Because I was not asked, miss, and it seemed unseemly to speak of it when the doctor had already pronounced his verdict." The housekeeper's tone carried the faint reproach of the righteous. "Though I'll say again that in 30 years of service in this house I never knew death to announce itself with the smell of something burning." Lord Peter set down his cup with deliberate care. "A medical curiosity, certainly. Miss Ashford, might I impose upon your hospitality to view your uncle's remains? The morning light is preferable for such examinations, as it eliminates the distortions produced by artificial illumination." The room in which Cedric Ashford had been laid bore all the hallmarks of that peculiar Victorian reverence for the dead. The curtains drawn to a sliver, the candles positioned at the bed's 4 corners in a configuration that suggested either religious devotion or the lingering influence of older, less Christian superstitions. The body itself was that of a man in his 60s, possessed of the florid complexion of someone whose diet had leaned heavily toward pork and mutton. What was not immediately apparent, however, was any mark or sign that might suggest the methodology of his departure from the mortal coil. Lord Peter approached the bed with the deliberate courtesy he afforded all corpses, a politeness born, perhaps, from his service in the Great War, where he had encountered rather too many of them to regard death as an occasion for squeamishness. He examined the fingernails first, then the lips, which possessed a peculiar pallor that did not entirely accord with the ruddy complexion of the face. "The windows," he said, without turning. "Were they open at any point during the evening? The library windows?" "No, sir," Miss Ashford replied, her voice betraying her confusion. "It was quite cold last evening. Uncle Cedric always preferred—" "The bedroom windows?" Lord Peter continued his examination with meticulous attention, his fingers moving with the precision of a concert pianist. I'm not certain, my lord," Miss Ashford admitted. "I did not come into this room until after he had been carried upstairs." Lord Peter straightened, and his eyes possessed that peculiar glitter that those acquainted with him recognized as the precursor to an observation of considerable consequence. "Mrs. Chelton, when you say the burning smell was distinctive, are you suggesting it was unfamiliar? Something outside the ordinary catalogue of household odors?" The housekeeper's face had gone rather pale. "It was like—" she hesitated, searching for words. "Like hair, sir, burned hair, though not quite. Something sweeter, perhaps, like burning plant matter. I thought perhaps it was the curtains catching light from a candle, but when I looked, everything seemed in order." "How very curious," Lord Peter murmured, returning his attention to the deceased. His fingers moved along the hairline with professional detachment, and then, there. A faint discoloration at the temple, barely perceptible beneath the skin's pallor, not a bruise precisely. Something else. Something that suggested not violence, but rather chemistry. He turned to face Miss Ashford, and his expression had altered in that manner that those who knew him had come to recognize as the moment when a puzzle had begun, however minutely, to resolve itself into intelligible patterns. "My dear girl," he said quietly, "I begin to suspect that your instincts have served you rather well. Your uncle has not died of apoplexy, nor of any failure of the heart. He has been murdered, though not in an manner that the local police would be equipped to recognize. The question now becomes precisely how one poisons a man using nothing but a candle wick and sufficient knowledge of chemistry. A question," he added with characteristic irony, "that I find myself most anxious to answer." The library of Brackenstall Manor was precisely the sort of room that one might expect to contain a man's final hours, lined with books that had been purchased more for their decorative properties than their intellectual merit, dominated by a leather wingback chair positioned before a fireplace of impressive but ultimately ineffectual grandeur. Lord Peter stood in the doorway for a considerable interval, his pale eyes moving across the room with the methodical precision of a man cataloguing evidence that did not yet present itself as such. "Describe his posture," he said to Miss Ashford, who had followed him with the determined expression of someone attempting to maintain composure in the face of mounting strangeness. "When the servants discovered him, was he recumbent in the chair, or had he attempted to rise?" "He was slumped forward, his head against the wing of the chair," she replied, consulting her memory with admirable accuracy. "His newspaper had fallen to the floor. Mrs. Chelton said he looked as though he had simply dozed off and not awakened, and yet Mrs. Chelton also perceived the smell of burning." Lord Peter moved toward the fireplace with the casual grace that masked his intensity. "The evening in question, what was the weather?" "Unusually mild, actually." "We had not lit a fire in the library for nearly a week." He turned sharply, and the movement conveyed more emphasis than any raised voice could have achieved. "The fireplace was unlit? Entirely unlit?" "Yes, my lord." "Why should that—" "Because it suggests, my dear Miss Ashford, that the burning smell could not have originated from the hearth, nor from any candle in conventional use." He approached the mantelpiece, examining the candlesticks arrayed upon it with the attention one might afford to objects of archaeological significance. There were 4 of them, silver plate of middling quality, each empty of candle. "Were candles burning here the evening of your uncle's death?" Miss Ashford frowned, her brow furrowing with the effort of recollection. I believe Mrs. Chelton mentioned that he preferred the library to be well lit during the evening hours. She would have placed candles here, yes, but I cannot be certain whether they were lit or merely present. The servants," Lord Peter said, turning to face her directly, "would know with absolute certainty. Mrs. Chelton in particular strikes me as a woman whose attention to household detail would extend to knowing which candles burned and which did not. The fact that she has not mentioned this detail suggests either that she did not notice the candle's status, or that she has chosen not to volunteer it. Which presents us with a rather intriguing question. Why would she withhold such information?" He moved to the chair in which Cedric Ashford had spent his final conscious moments, examining its upholstery with meticulous attention. The leather was worn in the manner of well-used furniture, the crevices harboring the accumulated dust of years. He produced a handkerchief from his pocket and, with surprising gentleness, ran it along the seam where the seat met the back. When he withdrew his hand, the cloth bore the faintest discoloration, a residue that appeared to be neither dust nor the ordinary detritus of daily use. "I require the services of a chemist," he announced, "and I require them with some expedition. Is there a competent medical man in Dentonby beyond your Dr. Hargreaves?" "There is a pharmacist," Miss Ashford ventured, uncertain. "Me, Mr. Pemberton. He has been established in the village for perhaps 15 years. He is rather more educated than one might expect from a man in his position." "Educated pharmacists are precisely what we require," Lord Peter murmured. He folded the handkerchief with deliberate care and placed it within an interior pocket. "Miss Ashford, I find myself compelled to ask a question of a delicate nature. Your uncle, what was his disposition, his temperament? Was he a man possessed of enemies?" She hesitated, and in that hesitation lay a volume of unspoken complexity. "He was a man of considerable wealth," she said finally, "and wealth, as I have observed, rarely brings contentment. He was exacting in his requirements of others, generous only when it served his purposes, and possessed of strong opinions regarding how others ought to conduct their lives. He had been estranged from my cousin Edward for some years, a dispute over business matters, and my aunt—" She trailed away, her eyes finding the window. "Your aunt," Lord Peter prompted gently. "My aunt has been exceedingly calm since his death," Miss Ashford finished, the words emerging with evident difficulty. "Too calm. When I attempted to comfort her yesterday, she seemed almost relieved. I found myself wondering whether—" She stopped abruptly, color rising in her cheeks. "Forgive me. That is disloyal." "Disloyalty," Lord Peter observed with characteristic precision, "is merely honesty that one fears others will judge unfavorably. Your observation is noted, and I assure you that disloyalty to the deceased pales considerably in comparison to the crime of murder itself. Your aunt has not left the house since your uncle's death." "No, my lord. She has remained in her room, ostensibly prostrated with grief." "Ostensibly," Lord Peter repeated, allowing the word to linger in the air like smoke. "A word that rise considerable implication. Tell me, has your aunt a lady's maid in attendance? Someone who might have access to her private quarters, her clothing, her correspondence? A Miss Whitmore?" "She has been with my aunt for nearly 10 years. Lord Peter moved toward the library door with the purposefulness of a man whose immediate course of action had resolved itself into crystalline clarity. "I believe it is time we conducted a more thorough examination of the household staff, Miss Ashford, particularly those whose duties place them in proximity to both your uncle and your aunt. For what we are investigating is not a crime of passion, nor one of simple avarice. We are investigating something far more deliberate, a conspiracy of silence, born of either genuine affection or calculated self-interest. The candle wick you see is not the murder weapon, it is merely the delivery mechanism. The true question is not how your uncle was poisoned, but rather, by whom, and more importantly, why that person believed they required the assistance of someone else to accomplish it. Mr. Pemberton's pharmacy occupied a modest storefront on Dentonby's High Street, its windows crowded with the accumulated pharmacopoeia of a village practice, tinctures of uncertain vintage, pill boxes in orderly rows, and that particular odor that all chemists' shops possess, compounded equally of carbolic, dried herbs, and the faint suggestion of desperation. The man himself proved to be considerably younger than Lord Peter's initial estimates, possessing the careful precision of someone who has learned, through rigorous study rather than inherited assumption. "Burned plant matter," Mr. Pemberton examined, the handkerchief with professional interest, bringing it to his nose with the practiced delicacy of a wine merchant assessing a doubtful vintage. "Specifically, this smells of, yes, oleander, but not merely oleander. There is something else beneath it, something far more toxic." He looked up from the cloth, his expression having altered to that particular intensity that overtakes a man when confronted with evidence of sophisticated malfeasance. "Might I inquire the context of this sample, Lord Wimsey? Or is discretion preferred?" "Discretion is always preferable," Lord Peter replied, "but in this instance I find myself inclined toward transparency. A gentleman of this village has died under circumstances that the local authorities have deemed natural. I am inclined to disagree with that assessment." Mr. Pemberton's eyes narrowed, and he moved toward his workbench with the efficiency of a man who has already reached a preliminary conclusion. "Give me precisely 1 hour," he said, "and I shall provide you with something approaching certainty. Though I confess, if my suspicions prove correct, we are discussing a method of poisoning that requires both considerable knowledge and even more considerable access to materials that ought not be freely available to the general population. Lord Peter occupied the intervening hour in a manner that would have appeared to casual observation to be entirely idle. He stood before the shop window, occasionally shifting his weight, and appeared to be examining the merchandise with the abstract attention one affords to familiar objects. In reality, his mind was executing a series of logical deductions with the precision of a calculating engine. The poisoning, if poison it was, had been delivered through the Candle Wick. This much was established. But candles were necessarily lit, and a lit candle burned at a consistent temperature. The compounds required to survive such combustion without releasing their toxic properties prematurely were limited to a very specific category of substances. Oleander, as Mr. Pemberton had identified, was toxic in its natural state, but would require careful preparation to survive the heat of a burning wick, unless— His thoughts were interrupted by Mr. Pemberton's reappearance, bearing a small glass vial containing a pale yellow powder. Oleander extract, the chemist announced without preamble, combined with compounds of arsenic. The oleander acts as a carrier, you see. It burns at a relatively low temperature, and as it does so, the volatile components are released into the air. The arsenic, however, does not fully volatilize. Instead, it releases as a fine particulate, almost invisible to the eye, certainly undetectable by smell once the burning plant matter has masked it. A person breathing in the vicinity of such a candle would gradually inhale the poison over a period of hours. The effects would be subtle at first, a tightness in the chest, perhaps a slight nausea, but the cumulative exposure would eventually prove fatal, and the symptoms would present themselves as a heart failure, Lord Peter said softly, particularly if the victim were already a man of compromised constitution. Brilliant, really, absolutely brilliant. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had acquired that particular quality that those who knew him recognized as dangerous. Mr. Pemberton, might such a preparation be synthesized by someone possessing a basic knowledge of chemistry? Someone who might, for instance, have access to a lady's extensive correspondence with a former governess who was herself educated in the sciences. It would require study, Mr. Pemberton admitted, but not genius. Merely determination and access to certain botanical materials. Why do you ask? Because, Lord Peter replied, accepting the vial with careful attention, I am beginning to suspect that we are investigating not a murder conceived in passionate anger, but rather one planned with the systematic precision of a woman who has spent years accumulating both knowledge and grievance. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, in your professional capacity, have you had occasion to dispense oleander extract to any of the local residents? The chemist's expression shifted, and he moved toward his ledger with the reluctance of a man being asked to violate a confidence. I have, he admitted after a prolonged interval. Approximately 8 months ago, I supplied such an extract to Miss Whitmore, Lady Ashford's lady's maid. She claimed it was for the treatment of a skin complaint. Oleander has certain applications in dermatology, though I confess her stated purpose seemed somewhat obscure. At the time, I thought little of it. 8 months, Lord Peter repeated, the words carrying the weight of implications, a considerable period of time in which to allow tension to accumulate, resentment to crystallize, and plans to mature. Mr. Pemberton, I must ask you to maintain absolute discretion regarding our conversation. What you have told me is of considerable importance, but it must not be discussed with anyone, not the doctor, not the constable, and most certainly not with any member of the Ashford household. Can I rely upon your professionalism in this matter? You can, Mr. Pemberton assured him, though his tone suggested considerable unease. Though I must confess I find myself thoroughly disturbed by the implications of what we have discussed. Disturbance is the natural response to discovering that one has inadvertently participated in facilitating a murder, Lord Peter observed with characteristic equanimity. Though you bear no responsibility, of course, the blame rests entirely with those who conceived the scheme and those who executed it. Which raises, rather uncomfortably, the question of precisely how many people knew of this plan. Was Miss Whitmore acting alone, or was she merely the instrument through which another's will was accomplished? He departed the pharmacy with the vial secured in his pocket, and his mind executing a series of increasingly uncomfortable deductions. The conspiracy that was beginning to reveal itself possessed a complexity that suggested not the impulsive revenge of a wronged servant, but rather something far more calculated, something that required accomplices, something that required motive layered upon motive, like the intricate structure of a carefully constructed musical score, and at the center of that score, Lord Peter suspected, stood a woman whose outward display of grief masked something far more dangerous, a satisfaction so profound that it had rendered her incautious enough to permit her assistant to purchase the very materials that would expose her. The afternoon light was beginning its inevitable descent toward the particulars of evening when Lord Peter returned to Brackenstall Manor, and he found Miss Ashford in the drawing-room, engaged in the futile occupation of embroidery, that refuge of genteel women faced with emotional turmoil they are not permitted to express through more visceral means. She set down her needlework with evident relief upon his entrance, her eyes searching his face for indications of progress. "You have discovered something," she said, and it was not a question. "I have discovered several somethings," Lord Peter replied, settling himself into a chair with the ease of a man whose nerves are sufficiently steady to permit him the luxury of apparent indolence. "The first of which is that your uncle was indeed poisoned, through a method of considerable ingenuity. The second is that Miss Whitmore, your aunt's lady's maid, purchased the materials necessary to accomplish this poisoning approximately 8 months ago. The third, and rather more vexing, is that I cannot yet determine with absolute certainty whether Miss Whitmore acted independently or at the behest of another, which raises the rather unpleasant question, have you any knowledge of your aunt's feelings toward your uncle, any indication that their marriage was other than what the world perceived it to be?" Miss Ashford set down her embroidery frame, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. "My aunt married my uncle when she was scarcely more than a girl," she said quietly. "She was a governess in his house, and he was a widower of some years. The marriage was, I believe, considered quite a triumph on her part. She elevated herself considerably in station, but I have often observed that elevation in station does not necessarily correlate with elevation in happiness, a philosophical observation, and one I suspect you have had considerable opportunity to verify," Lord Peter observed. "Tell me, has your aunt any income of her own, any financial independence?" "None whatsoever. Everything belongs to my uncle, belonged, I should say. The estate, the investments, all of it. My aunt has no more than her quarterly allowance, which has always been somewhat parsimonious for a woman in her position." "Ah," Lord Peter said softly, "and upon your uncle's death? Who inherits the estate?" "Primarily my cousin Edward, the eldest of my uncle's children from his first marriage. But there are provisions for my aunt. She is to receive a widow's portion and the use of the dower house for her lifetime. It is considerably less than she has been accustomed to." Lord Peter rose and moved toward the window, his fingers linked behind his back in that posture of concentrated thought that Miss Ashford had come to recognize as productive. "The dower house," he mused. "A charming euphemism for exile, really. A woman accustomed to the command of a substantial household, relegated to a smaller property, dape, and dent upon the goodwill of a stepson with whom she has presumably had limited affection. Motive begins to clarify itself, though the execution remains obscure. Miss Ashford, I must ask you a question of considerable delicacy. Your aunt, has she any particular companions among the servants? Any relationship that might be characterized as more intimate than the ordinary professional distance?" Miss Ashford's face flushed, and she looked away toward the window. "There has always been speculation," she admitted reluctantly. "Nothing confirmed, you understand. But the servants whisper that my aunt and Dr. Hargreaves that there has been a connection of some sort. He has called at the house far more frequently than medical necessity would seem to warrant. After my uncle's death, particularly so." "Dr. Hargreaves," Lord Peter repeated, and his tone suggested that a previously obscure puzzle piece had suddenly found its proper place. "The doctor who examined the body and pronounced the death natural. The doctor who certified the cause as apoplexy without apparently conducting any thorough examination. How very convenient." He returned to his chair, and his expression had taken on that particular quality of focused intensity that suggested the investigation had entered a new and potentially decisive phase. "Miss Ashford, I require your assistance in conducting what one might term a theatrical deception. It will involve a certain degree of risk, both to your reputation and to your person, and I will not proceed without your explicit consent. However, I believe it to be the only method by which we might draw the guilty parties into a position where they may be confronted with the full implications of their conspiracy." "What would you have me do?" she asked, and her voice was steady, though her fingers had resumed their anxious fidgeting. "You will send a note to Dr. Hargrave. S. To be delivered by messenger this evening. The note will indicate that you have become aware of certain irregularities in the medical assessment of your uncle's death, and that you are contemplating contacting the county police to request an exhumation and more thorough examination. You will further indicate that you would appreciate meeting with him privately to discuss the matter before taking such drastic action. A courtesy, you might frame it, given his long association with the family." "But that is deception," Miss Ashford protested, though her objection was clearly born of uncertainty rather than genuine refusal. "It is indeed," Lord Peter agreed without the slightest trace of contrition. "Deception is the appropriate response to conspiracy. The guilty parties have already employed deception far more egregious. They have substituted poison for apoplexy, murder for natural causes. We merely employ their own methodology against them. Dr. Hargreaves will meet with you. His anxiety will compel him to do so. And once he is sufficiently alarmed, once he has communicated that alarm to your aunt and Miss Whitmore, the cracks in their carefully constructed edifice will begin to widen. People under stress make mistakes, Miss Ashford. They reveal themselves through small gestures, through changes in routine, through the 1,000 tiny contradictions that emerge when fear overtakes caution." He rose once more, his movements fluid and deliberate. "I shall require the use of a room that provides adequate observation of the drawing room without being itself visible from that space. A connecting chamber, ideally, with a door that might be left slightly ajar. Can such an arrangement be accomplished without arousing suspicion among the household staff?" "The morning room adjoins the drawing room," Miss Ashford said slowly. "There is a connecting door, and it is rarely used. Mrs. Chelton might be persuaded to ensure that the household's attention is directed elsewhere during the evening hours." "Excellent," Lord Peter murmured. "Then we shall proceed. Send the note immediately, and Miss Ashford, do not permit your anxiety to manifest itself in any observable way. The guilty parties must believe that you are merely a concerned niece, acting with commendable but not excessive zeal. Overplaying one's hand is perhaps the most frequent cause of failure in such matters. The hours preceding Dr. Hargreaves's arrival possessed that peculiar quality of temporal distortion that accompanies anticipation of significance. The day seemed simultaneously to stretch and compress, minutes acquiring the weight of hours, intervals between activities condensing into nearly imperceptible transitions. Lord Peter occupied himself with a series of observations that would have appeared to the casual observer to constitute nothing more than idle wandering through the manor's various chambers. In reality, however, his meticulous examination of corridors, servants' passages, and the precise architectural relationships between rooms was designed to illuminate not merely the physical layout of Brackenstall, but the patterns of movement and observation that its inhabitants necessarily maintained. At precisely 8:30, as the autumn evening had descended into that quality of darkness that renders the distinction between dusk and night largely academic, Dr. Hargreaves's motor car drew to a halt before the manor's entrance. Lord Peter, positioned in the morning room with the connecting door, open to the precise degree that permitted observation without obvious visibility, heard the front doors opening, the murmured exchange of greetings between Miss Ashford and the physician, and the subsequent movement toward the drawing-room. The quality of the doctor's voice, its P.I. TCH elevated slightly above normal conversational register, its cadence betraying the anxiety that Miss Ashford's note had inevitably produced, confirmed Lord Peter's preliminary assessment that the man was operating from a position of considerable psychological vulnerability. Miss Ashford's voice, by contrast, maintained admirable composure. "Dr. Hargreaves, thank you for coming on such short notice. I confess I have been troubled since my uncle's death. The certainty of the conclusion seemed to me rather hasty, and I wondered whether perhaps a more thorough examination might not be warranted." "My dear Miss Ashford," the doctor replied, and there was in his tone that particular quality of false reassurance that practitioners of medicine employ when confronted with laypersons who have ventured into territories they ought to leave unexplored. The diagnosis was entirely consistent with Mr. Ashford's medical history. He suffered from hypertension, a condition well documented by my predecessor, and the failure of the heart under such circumstances is far from unusual. "And yet," Miss Ashford pressed, her voice acquiring a subtle edge, "it occurs to me that a man who has suffered from such a condition for years might reasonably be expected to have consulted with you more regularly than the records appear to indicate. My uncle's last appointment with you was some 14 months ago, was it not?" There was a prolonged silence, and Lord Peter perceived through the narrow opening the subtle shift in Dr. Hargreaves's posture, the slight stiffening of the shoulders, the minute tension that manifested in the jaw. "Your uncle was not a man who readily sought medical attention," the doctor replied, and his tone had acquired a defensive quality that had not previously characterized it. "Some patients prefer to manage their conditions independently. How very fortunate for those pat. E'ence that they happen to die at moments convenient to their physicians," Miss Ashford observed with a mildness that belied the calculated nature of the provocation. "Dr. Hargreaves, I have been contemplating whether I ought to request that the county authorities conduct an exhumation and more thorough examination. My uncle was, after all, a man of considerable means, and his death occurs at a moment that seems to benefit certain parties quite substantially. You will understand my desire to ensure that no impropriety has occurred." The doctor rose from his chair with a movement that suggested urgency rather than the leisurely conclusion of a social call. "That would be most inadvisable," he said, and his voice had lost the veneer of professional courtesy entirely. "Such an action would cause considerable distress to your aunt, and would result in precisely the sort of scandal that a family such as yours would presumably wish to avoid." "A threat?" Miss Ashford inquired with apparent innocence. "Surely not, Doctor. Merely advice offered in the interest of family harmony, I presume." It was at that precise moment that Lord Peter perceived the critical error, a moment of human weakness that would prove to be the fissure through which the entire structure of deception would eventually collapse. Dr. Hargreaves's hand moved toward his waistcoat pocket, the gesture conveying not threat precisely, but rather an instinctive motion born of anxiety and the desire to possess something. Tobacco, perhaps, or medication. The movement itself was insignificant, but its significance lay in what it revealed. The doctor was sufficiently distressed to lose awareness of his own physical comportment. Lord Peter emerged from the morning room with the timing of an actor making an entrance that had been practiced to the precise second. "Dr. Hargreaves," he said pleasantly, as though his appearance CE were the natural continuation of a conversation that had already been concluded, "I find myself possessed of several questions that I believe only you might adequately address. I am Lord Peter Wimsey, and I have been retained, quite unofficially I might add, to examine the circumstances surrounding Mr. Cedric Ashford's death. The preliminary examination suggests that apoplexy was not, in fact, the cause of death. The doctor's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical had the circumstances not been so profoundly serious. The carefully maintained composure shattered, replaced by an expression of such naked panic that for a moment he appeared to age a decade. His hand moved toward the door, then paused, as if he had suddenly recalled that flight would constitute an admission of guilt more damning than any verbal confession. "You cannot prove anything," he said, but his voice had acquired a hollow quality that suggested even he was uncertain of this claim. "On the contrary," Lord Peter replied with characteristic precision, "I possess both physical evidence, a handkerchief bearing traces of oleander extract and arsenic, and corroborating testimony from Mr. Pemberton regarding Miss Whitmore's purchase of precisely those materials. What I do not yet possess is a complete understanding of the hierarchy of conspiracy. Was Miss Whitmore acting independently, or was she merely executing the wishes of another? And more pressingly, Dr. Hargreaves, what precisely was your role in this affair? The certification of natural death was surely not insignificant. One might even characterize it as essential to the success of the enterprise. The doctor sank back into his chair, his face ashen. I did not. I had no knowledge of... He stopped, and his shoulders sagged in a posture of complete capitulation. Your aunt, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. It was all your aunt's doing, Miss Ashford. All of it. She came to me 8 months ago, spoke of her misery, her imprisonment in this house. She said that if her husband died, she would be free. I did not believe she meant it literally, but Miss Whitmore appeared one evening with the materials already prepared, and your aunt... He did not complete the sentence. He did not need to. The confession hung in the air like the scent of burned candle wick, undeniable and utterly damning. The drawing-room had become something rather like a confessional, though one conducted in the midst of Edwardian furnishings and beneath the unsympathetic gaze of ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to regard the unfolding drama with a mixture of disapproval and resigned familiarity. Dr. Hargreaves sat with his head in his hands, his professional dignity thoroughly obliterated, whilst Miss Ashford stood at the mantelpiece with the rigid posture of someone steeling themselves against an impulse toward either violence or hysteria. Lord Peter, by contrast, remained in that state of composed detachment that those who knew him recognized as characteristic of the moment when intellectual puzzle had been resolved, and only the tedious mechanics of denouement remained. He moved toward the bell-pull with deliberate purpose. "We shall require the constable," he announced with a matter-of-factness, "of a man ordering refreshment, and also your aunt, Miss Ashford, and Miss Whitmore, though I confess I am considerably less interested in her testimony than in the testimony of the woman who orchestrated this rather elaborate affair. Dr. Hargreaves, I would strongly recommend that you prepare yourself for the inevitable consequences of your participation in this business. Complicity in murder, regardless of the degree of active involvement, carries implications that no subsequent cooperation with the authorities will entirely mitigate." The doctor looked up, his eyes possessing that peculiar quality of desperation that overtakes men who have suddenly perceived the full scope of their catastrophe. "I did not kill him," he protested, though the words emerged with the hollow resonance of a prayer that even the supplicant no longer believes will be answered. I merely failed to investigate properly. I permitted her narrative to supersede my professional obligations. But I did not administer the poison. I did not... No, Lord Peter agreed with a coolness that bordered upon cruelty. You did not personally administer the poison. You merely ensured that no thorough examination would be conducted. You merely signed a death certificate, certifying a cause that you had not adequately verified. You merely permitted your personal affections to override both your professional ethics and your legal obligations. The law, I fear, makes remarkably little distinction between these degrees of culpability. Complicity, Dr. Hargreaves, is a curious beast. It consumes its own practitioners as readily as the principals. When Mrs. Chelton appeared in response to the bell, her expression suggesting that she had already begun to suspect the contours of what was transpiring, Lord Peter addressed her with that particular courtesy that he reserved for those servants who possessed the intelligence to understand the implications of what they were being asked to do. "Mrs. Chelton, I require that you bring Mrs. Cedric Ashford and Miss Whitmore to this room. You may indicate that there has been a development regarding the circumstances of Mr. Ashford's death, and that Lord Peter Wimsey, visiting in his capacity as a friend of the family, has requested their presence. You will imply, without explicitly stating, that their cooperation in clearing up certain administrative matters would be appreciated. Can I rely upon your discretion in communicating this message?" The housekeeper's response was a slight nod, though her eyes betrayed a complexity of emotion, disapproval certainly, but also a curious satisfaction, as though some long-held suspicion was finally acquiring the status of confirmed fact. The interval that followed was characterized by that peculiar quality of temporal suspension that precedes moments of irrevocable consequence. Lord Peter seated himself with the casual indifference of a man awaiting nothing more significant than afternoon tea, whilst Miss Ashford resumed her position at the mantelpiece, and Dr. Hargreaves maintained his posture of abject despair. The drawing-room seemed to contract around them, the shadows deepening, the very air acquiring a weight that had not previously characterized it. When Mrs. Cedric Ashford appeared in the doorway, she presented an appearance of remarkable composure for a woman whose entire conspiracy was in the process of unraveling. She was a woman of perhaps 55, possessed of the kind of faded beauty that speaks of years spent in subordinate positions, waiting for elevation that seemed never to arrive. Her dress was impeccably arranged, her hair precisely ordered, and her expression conveyed nothing more than mild curiosity at the summons. "My dear," she said, addressing Dr. Hargreaves with the sort of casual affection that a woman might employ toward a tradesman, "what is the meaning of this? I understood there was some matter requiring discussion." "There is indeed," Lord Peter replied before the doctor could respond, rising from his seat with the fluid grace that characterized all his physical movements. "Lady Ashford, I am Lord Peter Wimsey, and I have been investigating the circumstances surrounding your husband's death. I regret to inform you that my investigation has led to conclusions somewhat at variance with the medical assessment provided by Dr. Hargreaves. Your husband, I have determined, was poisoned through the agency of a candle wick treated with oleander extract and arsenic compounds. The poisoning was executed with considerable sophistication, suggesting both knowledge of chemistry and access to materials that would have required deliberate procurement. Her face did not change. The composure remained intact, as though she had anticipated this moment with sufficient clarity that its actual arrival constituted nothing more than the expected continuation of a predetermined sequence of events. "That is a serious accusation," she said quietly, and there was in her tone neither denial nor admission, merely an acknowledgement of the claim's gravity. "It is," Lord Peter agreed, "as is the accusation that you conspired with Miss Whitmore to accomplish this poisoning, with Dr. Hargreaves' participation restricted, to ensuring that no thorough investigation of the death would be conducted. The evidence is considerable, and the testimony of Dr. Hargreaves has already provided corroboration of the essential facts." He paused, allowing the weight of the accusation to settle fully. "I find myself curious, however, regarding your motivations. Your husband was a man of means, certainly, and his death improves your financial position not at all. Indeed, the opposite is true. You will be relegated to the dower house, dependent upon your stepson's goodwill. So I am moved to wonder, what precisely was worth such considerable sacrifice?" She turned her head slightly, and her eyes found Dr. Hargreaves with an expression that might have been tenderness, had it not been so thoroughly suffused with calculation. "Everything," she said simply. "He promised me everything, and I was no longer willing to exist as I had been existing." The word "everything" hung in the drawing-room like a particularly noxious perfume, permeating the air with implications that seemed to expand with each passing moment. Lord Peter, who had acquired considerable experience in the interpretation of such utterances, recognized in that single word the crystallization of years of accumulated resentment, thwarted ambition, and the peculiar desperation that overtakes individuals who have come to perceive their own existence as an intolerable burden. "Everything," he repeated, allowing the word to acquire additional weight through his articulation of it. "A curious currency for murder, Lady Ashford. Most perpetrators of such crimes concern themselves with considerably more mundane commodities, money certainly, or the removal of obstacles to their advancement. But you were willing to risk your freedom, your reputation, indeed your very life, for the promise of what? Affection? Companionship? The society of a man who has demonstrated, through his participation in your conspiracy, that his own moral fiber is sufficiently compromised that no promise he might make could reasonably be trusted?" She did not respond immediately, and in that silence there occurred a subtle shift in her demeanor. The composure that had characterized her entrance seemed to fracture, revealing beneath it the raw edges of emotions too long suppressed to permit of dignified containment. When she finally spoke, her voice had acquired a tremulous quality that had not previously characterized it. "You understand nothing," she said, and the words emerged with the force of an accusation. "Nothing of what it is to exist in a household as an ornament, as a piece of furniture that happens to possess a capacity for reproduction. My husband—" She paused, and her eyes moved toward the window, seeking something in the darkness beyond the glass. "My husband regarded me with a contempt so profound that it was scarcely worth the effort of expressing. I was a governess when he married me. I elevated myself in station, yes, but I purchased that elevation with the entirety of myself. I was to bear him no more children. He had sufficient issue from his previous marriage. I was to manage the household, to receive his guests with appropriate grace, to occupy my position with the discretion of a woman grateful for her improved circumstances." She turned back to face them, and her expression had undergone a transformation so complete that she appeared to have become a different person entirely, not the composed matron who had entered moments before, but rather a woman in the grip of emotions so violent that they threatened to overwhelm her capacity for articulation. "And then," she continued, her voice now acquiring an almost theatrical quality, "he came to this house. Dr. Hargreaves came to attend to my husband's increasingly frequent complaints, and in his presence I perceived something that I had believed to be extinct within me, the possibility of being regarded as a human being rather than as a possession. He saw me, Lord Wimsey. He actually saw me, and in that seeing I experienced the most profound happiness that I have known in 20 years of marriage." Lord Peter's expression did not alter, though his eyes had acquired that particular intensity that suggested he was in the process of reconstructing an emotional architecture that had appeared, moments before, to be composed of rage and calculation alone. "An affair," he said quietly, stating the fact rather than inquiring after it. "A conversation," she corrected, with surprising asperity. "A series of conversations conducted in the garden, in the village, in circumstances that required the utmost discretion. Nothing more, nothing overtly improper. But for me, those conversations constituted a form of resurrection. I began to imagine a different life, a life in which I was not merely the wife of a wealthy man, but the companion of a man who valued my intellect, my observations, my very existence as a separate entity rather than as an appendage to his own. And your husband discovered this arrangement," Lord Peter suggested, though his tone indicated he was already possessed of considerable certainty regarding the course of events. "He did," she confirmed. "He was informed by one of the servants. I have never determined precisely which, though I suspect it was the footman whom my husband had always favored and whom I had never shown particular attention. The fury that consumed him was—" She paused, searching for adequate language. "It was disproportionate. He threatened to destroy Dr. Hargreaves professionally. He threatened to expose the affair, such as it was, to every person of consequence in the county. He threatened to confine me to the manor, to permit me no contact with the outside world. He promised me a lifetime of isolation as punishment for what he perceived as my betrayal." Miss Ashford had moved to stand beside Lord Peter, her expression conveying a mixture of horror and a dawning sympathy that suggested she was in the process of revising her earlier judgments of her aunt's culpability. "And Miss Whitmore?" Lord Peter inquired. "What was her role in this affair? How does one persuade a lady's maid to participate in the poisoning of her employer?" "Miss Whitmore had been treated abominably by my husband," Mrs. Cedric Ashford replied. "Years of his petty cruelties, his refusal to pay her adequate wages, his threats to dismiss her without reference, should she prove inadequate to his exacting standards. She approached me, I did not approach her, with a proposal. She had family connections in the scientific world, and she indicated that she possessed access to materials that might accomplish a particular objective. I initially rejected the proposal as the fantasy of a woman driven to desperation, but as my husband's threats escalated, as I perceived the genuine prospect of my remaining years being consumed in imprisonment, I reconsidered. Lord Peter moved toward her with a peculiar grace. his posture conveying neither condemnation nor absolution, merely an observation of her presence as a fellow participant in the human drama. "So you became conspirators," he said, "united in your recognition that your respective imprisonments could not be endured. And you believed that in Dr. Hargreaves you had found an accomplice who, through his professional position, might ensure that the murder would be attributed to natural causes. Tell me, Lady Ashford, did you ever consider that your conspiracy might fail? That the evidence might be insufficient? That your carefully orchestrated deception might unravel?" "I knew," she said simply, "that it would eventually unravel. I have always known. But I was willing to accept that price in exchange for even a brief period of freedom." The admission hung in the air with a peculiar finality, as though Mrs. Cedric Ashford had spoken the final words of a performance that had consumed her entire being, and having delivered them, found herself curiously emptied of further resources for dissimulation. Lord Peter regarded her with an expression that those who knew him would have recognized as approaching something uncomfortably proximate to sympathy, a sensation he ordinarily took considerable pains to conceal beneath layers of ironic commentary and aristocratic detachment. "And Miss Whitmore?" he inquired, his voice acquiring that particular quality of gentle firmness that suggested he was prepared to extract the complete architecture of conspiracy, regardless of how many times the confession required reiteration. "Where does she stand in this matter? Is she merely a faithful servant, or does she possess her own investment in the successful conclusion of this enterprise?" Before Mrs. Cedric Ashford could respond, the drawing-room door opened with a violence that suggested its entrance had been executed by someone no longer concerned with the maintenance of social proprieties. Miss Whitmore stood in the doorway, and her appearance conveyed a state of emotional disturbance so profound that even Lord Peter, possessed as he was of considerable experience in reading human comportment, found himself momentarily surprised by the intensity of her agitation. "I will not remain silent whilst she claims sole responsibility," Miss Whitmore announced, her voice trembling with an anger that seemed directed equally at her mistress and at the assembled company. "I will not permit her to present herself as a reluctant participant in this affair, as though she merely acquiesced to proposals that came from elsewhere. It was she who conceived the scheme, she who refined it, she who ensured that every detail was executed with absolute precision." Mrs. Cedric Ashford's face underwent a transformation so dramatic that she appeared momentarily diminished, her carefully maintained composure fragmenting entirely. "Miss Whitmore, I beg you to reconsider." "Reconsider what?" the lady's maid interjected with a bitterness that suggested years of accumulated resentment seeking explosive release. "That I should permit you to present yourself to the authorities as a woman driven to desperation by her husband's cruelty, when in fact you orchestrated this entire affair with the precision of a chess player. You came to me not as a supplicant but as a strategist. You explained precisely how the poison should be prepared, how it should be administered, how the evidence should be concealed. I merely executed your designs." Lord Peter's eyes narrowed slightly, and he resumed his seat with the air of a man who was perceived that the narrative he had constructed required substantial revision. "A rather significant distinction," he observed mildly. "Miss Whitmore, you are suggesting that Lady Ashford possessed knowledge of chemistry sufficiently sophisticated to design this particular method of poisoning." "She possessed more than knowledge," Miss Whitmore replied. "She possessed a correspondence, years of correspondence, with a woman who had been her governess before she entered service in this household. That woman was educated in the sciences at a level that was most unusual for her sex and station. They maintained contact through letters, discussing not merely domestic matters but scientific theories, chemical compounds, and various methodologies of producing substances with particular properties. Miss Ashford, who had remained motionless throughout this revelation, now moved to an armchair and sank into it with the movement of someone whose capacity to maintain vertical posture had been suddenly and entirely exhausted. Her face had acquired a pallor that suggested the revelation of Miss Whitmore's knowledge regarding the correspondence had constituted a shock of considerable magnitude. "You read the letters," Mrs. Cedric Ashford whispered. "And it was not a question." "I did," Miss Whitmore confirmed with a defiance that suggested she regarded the invasion of privacy as entirely justified by the circumstances that had necessitated it. Years of them, arranged in your wardrobe beneath your undergarments. I read of your growing desperation, your increasing interest in methods of solving impossible situations, your detailed discussions with your former governess regarding the properties of various botanical substances. And when your husband's conduct became increasingly intolerable, when you mentioned to me in passing your fantasies regarding his sudden demise, I understood precisely what you were contemplating. I merely provided the materials and the technical execution that you had intellectually designed. Lord Peter rose once more, and his movements possessed that particular quality of fluid purpose that suggested he had arrived at a conclusion of some significance. So we have, he said quietly, a conspiracy that is considerably more sophisticated than initially appeared, a conspiracy that spans not merely the household itself, but extends to correspondence with an external party who possessed scientific knowledge, a conspiracy that was years in its conception, refined through careful study and systematic planning, and a conspiracy in which the principal architect is a woman who has spent 2 decades in apparent docility, whilst in reality she has been accumulating both knowledge and justification for the act of murder. He turned to face Mrs. Cedric Ashford directly, and his expression conveyed neither judgment nor approval, merely an observation conducted with the precision of a naturalist examining an interesting specimen. Tell me, Lady Ashford, did you ever consider alternatives? Did there exist at any point in your deliberati? On's a moment at which you entertained the possibility of simply departing, of abandoning this household, this marriage, this entire suffocating arrangement, and building a different life elsewhere? She looked up at him, and her eyes possessed a peculiar luminosity that suggested tears were imminent, but being held in abeyance through sheer force of will. I'm a woman of 55 years, she said quietly. I possess no independent means, no family to shelter me, no marketable skills beyond the management of a household. Where precisely was I to go? What exactly was I to do? The world does not provide substantially more comfort to women of my age and circumstances than does the prison into which I had been placed. At least, she added with a bitterness that was almost palpable, my husband could be relied upon to provide material sustenance, however grudgingly extended. And now? Lord Peter inquired, though his tone suggested he already possessed a complete understanding of the answer. Now I shall have neither husband nor sustenance, she replied, with the flat resignation of someone who has finally perceived the full consequences of her actions. I shall have the dower house and my stepson's charity, which will be offered with the most profound reluctance. I shall be the woman who murdered her husband, and the nature of my crime will ensure that I am forever beyond the pale of respectable society. Dr. Hargreaves will face ruin, Miss Whitmore will face imprisonment, and I shall face the remainder of my existence knowing that the brief interval of happiness I purchased was inadequate compensation for the catastrophe it has precipitated. The constable's arrival, when it occurred some 30 minutes later, seemed almost anticlimactic. The introduction of bureaucratic procedure into a space that had been populated, until that moment, by the raw machinery of human confession and mutual recrimination. Inspector Calloway was a man of the sort that one frequently encounters in village constabularies, competent enough in matters of straightforward criminality, but possessed of that particular quality of intellectual limitation that renders complex motivations and sophisticated deceptions somewhat beyond his immediate capacity for comprehension. Lord Peter provided him with a comprehensive summary of the evidence, delivered with that particular combination of precision and pedagogical clarity that had occasionally proven effective in persuading official representatives of the law to accept conclusions that their own investigative capacities might not have independently reached. The handkerchief bearing traces of oleander and arsenic was produced and explained. Mr. Pemberton's testimony regarding Miss Whitmore's purchase of materials was cited. Dr. Hargreaves's confession was documented, and the entire chain of deduction that had culminated in the unmasking of the conspiracy was laid bare with a thoroughness that left little room for subsequent misunderstanding. "It is quite remarkable," Inspector Calloway observed, his tone suggesting a man who possessed limited familiarity with crimes of such complexity that such a conspiracy could have been conceived and executed without arousing greater suspicion. Poisoning through a candle wick. I confess I had never encountered such a methodology. Few have, Lord Peter acknowledged with a courtesy that barely concealed a certain weariness at being required to address matters that seemed to him entirely elementary, which was, of course, precisely the point. The Perpetra. Tors relied upon the assumption that your investigation would proceed along conventional lines, that you would accept the medical assessment without subjecting it to thorough scrutiny. The beauty of the scheme, if one may employ such a term in reference to a criminal enterprise, lay in its exploitation of precisely those assumptions that govern official investigations of sudden death in individuals of advanced years. Mrs. Cedric Ashford was taken into custody with a docility that suggested she welcomed the removal from the drawing-room, from Brackenstall Manor, from the entire architecture of her previous existence. Dr. Hargreaves followed, his face bearing an expression of such profound devastation that one might have imagined him to be the primary victim of the conspiracy rather than its male accomplice. Miss Whitmore remained in the drawing-room, her defiance having given way to a peculiar numbness that suggested the reality of her situation had only now begun to manifest itself with adequate force. When the constables had departed, bearing their prisoners toward whatever arrangements the county authorities deemed appropriate, Lord Peter found himself alone in the drawing-room with Miss Ashford, whose face bore the particular pallor that accompanies the discovery that one's family is composed of individuals substantially more complex and considerably more desperate than one had previously imagined. "Your aunt," he said quietly, settling himself into a chair with the air of a man preparing to conduct a final and perhaps most important conversation, "is a woman of considerable intelligence. That intelligence, combined with sufficient desperation and the availability of means, has produced a tragedy that might have been prevented through any number of alternative courses of action. The interesting question, from a philosophical perspective, is not whether her crime was justified. The law provides no justification for murder, and rightly so. Rather, the interesting question is what precisely we might conclude regarding the nature of justice itself when confronted with a crime born not of malice, but of a desperation so profound that it overwhelmed even the basic human instinct towards self-preservation. "Should I feel sympathy for her?" Miss Ashford asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "She murdered my uncle. Whatever his deficiencies, as a husband, he did not deserve to die poisoned whilst reading his newspaper. Sympathy and justice are not obligated to coincide," Lord Peter replied, his tone acquiring that particular quality of philosophical detachment that had characterized some of his most penetrating observations. "Your uncle was, by all accounts, a man of considerable cruelty and limited moral imagination. His death was accomplished through methodology that he neither perceived nor anticipated. One might argue, though I personally refrain from such argumentation, that the world is not substantially diminished by his departure from it. However, one must simultaneously acknowledge that permitting individuals to murder those against whom they harbor legitimate grievances would constitute a rather catastrophic social arrangement. The law exists, in part, because we have collectively acknowledged that our individual perceptions of justice are unreliable guides to actual justice." He rose and moved toward the window, his gaze directed toward the darkened grounds of Brackenstall Manor. "Your aunt will stand trial. She will almost certainly be convicted. Whether she will be hanged or imprisoned for a term of years will depend upon the sympathies of the judge and jury, upon the persuasiveness of her counsel, and upon those intangible factors that govern the exercise of legal mercy. Dr. Hargreaves will face lesser charges, though his complicity is undeniable. And Miss Whitmore presents a more complex case, as she acted in the capacity of both accomplice and primary technician of the crime. What will become of them?" Miss Ashford inquired. "They will become," Lord Peter said, turning to face her, "examples, not in the sense that justice is intended to constitute public entertainment or moral instruction, but rather in the sense that their fates will serve to reinforce those social structures and legal prohibitions that permit civilization to maintain itself in the face of human impulses toward violence and vengeance. Your aunt chose a path that seemed to her to offer liberation from an intolerable situation. Instead, it has led her toward a different form of imprisonment, one that is legal, systematic, and enduring. He moved toward the door, his movement suggesting that his presence at Brackenstall Manor had concluded its purpose, and that departure was now indicated. "Miss Ashford, you demonstrated considerable courage in sending that letter, in your willingness to assist in unmasking this conspiracy despite the fact that it involved members of your own family. Do not permit the knowledge of your aunt's desperation to undermine that courage. The world requires individuals of conscience who are willing to confront criminality, regardless of the personal cost or emotional complexity involved. You have done well." As he departed the drawing room and ascended the stairs toward the guest chamber in which his modest belongings had been arranged, Lord Peter found himself contemplating not the solution he had achieved, but rather the deeper questions that the case had raised regarding the nature of desperation, the limits of human endurance, and the peculiar gap that frequently manifests itself between legal justice and moral complexity. The morning that succeeded the night of confession arrived with that particular quality of autumnal brightness that renders the landscape simultaneously more beautiful and infinitely more melancholy. Lord Peter descended the staircase of Brackenstall Manor with Bunter following at an appropriately respectful distance, bearing his lordship's travelling cases with the practised efficiency of a man who had executed such manoeuvres countless times across the geography of England. The household had assumed that peculiar quality of disarray that follows upon the sudden removal of its principal authority. Servants moved through the corridors with the uncertainty of individuals no longer quite certain of their precise function or hierarchical position. Miss Ashford awaited him in the entrance hall, and she had acquired in the intervening hours something of that quality of premature gravitas that often overtakes young persons who have been thrust suddenly into circumstances demanding that they assume responsibilities for which their years have not adequately prepared them. She extended her hand with a composure that he suspected was being maintained only through considerable force of will. "You are departing, then," she said, and it was not a question. "I am," Lord Peter confirmed, his tone acquiring that particular lightness that characterized his manner when discussing matters of practical conclusion. "My presence here has served its purpose, and my continued residence would only prolong a situation that must now be processed through the proper channels of legal and administrative machinery. You will find that the constable will require additional statements, that solicitors will appear bearing documents requiring your signature, and that the entire apparatus of justice will commence its ponderous but ultimately inevitable operation." "Will she hang?" Miss Ashford asked, the words emerging with evident difficulty. "My aunt, why? Else she be executed." Lord Peter adjusted his gloves with meticulous attention, the gesture serving as a temporary refuge from the necessity of responding to a question whose answer was genuinely uncertain. "That depends," he said finally, "upon factors that lie beyond my capacity to predict. A sympathetic judge might recommend mercy. A jury composed of men who have themselves experienced the peculiar desperation that accompanies domestic unhappiness might exercise clemency. Or society, in its collective wisdom, might determine that the severity of the crime demands the ultimate penalty, regardless of the humanitarian considerations that might suggest leniency. The law is, I have observed, a curious amalgamation of statute and sentiment, and the balance between these elements varies considerably depending upon time, place, and the particular composition of those charged with its administration." He paused, and his pale eyes acquired that quality of penetrating observation that suggested he was in the process of reaching some conclusion that extended beyond the immediate circumstances. "Your aunt committed murder, Miss Ashford. This fact is inarguable. However, she did so from motivations that, whilst not legally defensible, are comprehensible to anyone possessed of imagination sufficient to perceive the nature of her imprisonment. She spent 20 years in a household governed by a man who regarded her with contempt. She experienced a brief interval of human recognition through the agency of Dr. Hargreaves, and when her husband attempted to extinguish even that limited consolation, she chose murder rather than accept a return to the isolation from which that recognition had temporarily liberated her. "Is that an excuse?" Miss Ashford inquired, her tone suggesting genuine uncertainty rather than accusation. "It is an explanation," Lord Peter replied with characteristic precision. Excuses are something quite different. They suggest that the perpetrator bears diminished responsibility for their actions. I offer no excuse for your aunt's crime. Rather, I merely acknowledge that the desperation which motivated it is sufficiently comprehensible that we might view her as something other than a simple monster. Which brings me to a matter of some delicacy. Miss Whitmore, Miss Ashford's expression altered subtly, suggesting that this particular subject constituted territory she had been contemplating with considerable unease. What of her? Miss Whitmore is, in many respects, a more complex figure than your aunt, Lord Peter continued, moving toward the entrance with the measured pace of a man conducting a final meditation before departure. She acted not merely from the desire to assist her mistress, but from her own accumulation of grievance and resentment. She possessed knowledge of chemistry. This suggests either self-education or access to instruction that extended beyond what one might expect from a servant of her station. She acquired materials specifically designed to accomplish poisoning. This suggests agency and intent that extended beyond mere compliance, and she subsequently revealed the extent of her own knowledge and participation, suggesting either a desire for recognition or a need to establish her own culpability as something distinct from mere instrumentality. He paused at the threshold, and his expression had acquired that particular quality of ironic melancholy that characterized those moments when he permitted himself to acknowledge the fundamental tragedy that resided at the heart of human existence. "Miss Whitmore will almost certainly receive a sentence considerably less severe than your aunt's, assuming the courts recognize her status as secondary participant rather than principal architect. However, she has nonetheless sacrificed her freedom and her future in service to a conspiracy that, regardless of its emotional legitimacy, constitutes a violation of the fundamental law that governs civilized society. One might conclude that she has purchased a form of justice through that sacrifice, not the justice she sought for herself, but a different sort of justice altogether." He turned back to face Miss Ashford once more, and his expression conveyed a gravity that had been largely absent from their previous interactions. "You will likely encounter, in the months and years that follow, suggestions that you ought to feel guilt regarding your role in exposing this conspiracy. You should not permit such suggestions to gain purchase upon your conscience. You acted from motives that were entirely defensible. Your conviction that injustice had occurred, and your willingness to expose that injustice despite its personal cost. The world requires such individuals. Do not permit the knowledge of your aunt's desperation to undermine your certainty regarding the rightness of your actions." Bunter appeared with Lord Peter's hat, executing the gesture of presentation with the practiced grace of a man who had performed such actions countless times. As they moved toward the motor that awaited them on the drive, Miss Ashford called after him, her voice carrying across the autumn morning with a plaintiveness that suggested she sought something more than mere farewell. "Will you return to Brackenstall?" she asked. Lord Peter paused, regarding the manor with an expression that seemed to contemplate not merely its physical structure, but the entire weight of human tragedy that had accumulated within its walls. "I think not," he replied quietly. "Brackenstall Manor has served its purpose as a puzzle to be solved. To return would be to impose upon the solution an unnecessary coda. Better to depart and permit tea. A house to resume its existence beyond the purview of investigation and revelation. Besides," he added, his tone acquiring a characteristic lightness, "Bunter informs me that there is an excellent club in London that serves a claret of considerable merit, and my absence from it has extended to an unconscionable duration. The Candle Wick has burned to its conclusion. It remains only to attend to matters of slightly greater consequence." With that observation, Lord Peter Wimsey departed Brackenstall Manor, leaving behind the architecture of conspiracy, desperation, and the peculiar intersection of justice and human complexity that had briefly illuminated the manor's corridors, like the flame of that poisoned candle whose mechanism of murder had revealed itself at last, to be far simpler than the emotional landscape from which it had emerged.